Please. Yes, please. Dr. Mona, can we have the microphone here?
My question is to Prof. Dylan William about the learning tasks. How do we draw that thin line between a learning task that is too easy to initiate learning and a one that is too difficult with a high cognitive load to inhibit or hamper learning? I mean, do we gear the level of difficulty to the level of the students or to the target that we want to reach? What indicators can help us decide on the difficulty of the learning task that we want our students to go through? Thank you.
I think there's no simple answer to your question. I think that the reason that the research on cognitive load is important is not because it tells you what to do, because it doesn't. We can't measure cognitive load. It tells you about things you need to be aware of. And so I think the one important consequence is the fact that the students successfully completed the task does not mean they've learned it. It doesn't mean they've learned it, they'll remember it 2 weeks later. So I think that would mean let's check our students' understanding sometime later. The second thing to think about is obviously, even though medical students are quite highly selected, they're still quite varied. And therefore, I suggest as a general strategy, starting with challenging tasks of moderate challenge, and then thinking about ways in which you might support the people who are struggling and add challenges to the ones who actually find it a bit easy. So let me give you quite an easy example from my own high school teaching. I gave my students the task of estimating the heating requirements of the school building, and it was a big, large, rectangular building. And so I told them, there's 20 points for this. Every time you ask me for some information, it will cost you 1 point. And so it turned, the reason I'd chosen this task was because I wanted them to discover for themselves the concept of specific heat capacity. Because at some point, to do this, they would have to figure out how much energy does it take to heat 1 cubic meter of air by 1 degree. So nobody was going to get 20 points, but some groups managed to get 19 because they realized the only piece of information they needed was the specific heat capacity of air. So by having that kind of challenging task where everybody can start on it, but you can provide more support to some of the learners may be helpful, but we have to be very cautious. Sometimes our support, our help, helps the student complete the task, but because the help we gave them was too helpful, they're successful in the task, but they don't learn it. And so I think the major contribution of cognitive load theory, as I said earlier, is not to tell us how to teach, it's to tell us to be skeptical about our students' understanding. Yes, they completed the task, but let's check they still understand this 2 weeks later, because performance is not the same as learning.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any other question anywhere? Yes, please.
Thank you for this informative lecture, talk. My question is to Dr. William. Did you just say, this is my second question, that assessing performance is not learning? Or?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So let me be clear. Psychologists use 2 different words. Performance is how well students complete the learning task. Learning is the changes in long-term memory that result. And what the work of Robert Bjork and others has shown is you can have learning without an increase in performance. And you can have an increase in performance without any long-term learning. So the important point is, as I said earlier, the thing to be skeptical about, but the fact that students complete a task, I mean, this is the thing that really made me reject cognitive load theory for a long, long time. I could not believe that students could satisfactorily complete a task on their own that was designed to teach them something. They could actually complete that satisfactorily and yet not learn it. But that is what the research shows very clearly. And that's what my experience showed. I was just mystified. You know, how can they do this today and not do it 2 weeks later? You know, this is why teachers get joked at for saying, I taught it, they just didn't learn it. Well, yes, I taught it and they performed appropriately, but the long-term learning wasn't there. And I think that's what we have to be cautious about.
Okay.
We're seduced by this idea that if they could do it at the end of the lesson, it was a good lesson, but it might not stick. That's the problem.
That leads me to the main question, is that I know you mentioned that teaching or curriculum should focus on long-term memory, or modalities that will lead to long-term memory, and you showed us like 4 or 5 theories about that, but in terms of practicality we did not see much. So my question is that what's your advice in terms of practicality, and especially when it comes to performance, where you were surprised that it does not lead to any form of learning? So how are we going to enhance long-term learning and long-term memory? Because most of the studies says that you cannot retain more than 25% of what you have learned, regardless of what you do. So as put aside all these theories, in terms of practicality, how can I improve or design my curriculum to improve long-term memory and learning?
Yeah, basically there are lots of studies out there that have very strong conclusions. You remember more of what you do than what you see, and more of what you see than what you hear. And there's this famous cone of learning from Edgar Dale, which is absolute nonsense. There is no evidence behind that. So I think that I wouldn't take those figures at 25% seriously. So that's what I was saying earlier, is that research can never tell medical educators what to do. Your contexts are too complex. But what it can do is suggest some priorities. And I think that right now, the 2 things that seem to have the best evidenced impact on long-term learning are distributed practice and practice testing. And there's a third idea, which is interleaved practice. So in a lecture, for example, you might, rather than doing 1 hour on one thing, you might do 20 minutes on one thing, 20 minutes on a second thing, and 20 minutes on a third thing, and then the next day, come back to those things. So the idea that the learning is interleaved, so interleaved practice, distributed practice, and practice testing have all been shown to have really major effects. And they certainly seem to make learning sticky. But there's a wonderful book called Make It Stick, written by 2 psychologists and a journalist, so it's quite readable. Make It Stick, the first author is Brown, and that actually is a very nice summary of what we know about how to make our teaching more memorable.
Okay, any further questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My question is about a formative assessment and continuous assessment, or classwork, as we call it sometimes, and the final or summative assessment. How could we really strike a balance practically? Because we have challenges in practice. Striking a balance between not causing too much assessment or excessive assessment for the students, which could have a negative impact, of course. And especially if you add some motivation, some weight of scores for your formative assessment. So in real practice, you have formative assessment, continuous assessment, and final or summative assessment. And sometimes this really looks too much for the students. Thank you very much.
Richard, do you want to start? Have a go at that?
I'll let you kick off, Dylan, and maybe pop in with some observations from practice. I don't want to disturb your flow.
Okay, so the first thing to say is that, as I said earlier, I don't think it's helpful to think of formative and summative as kinds of assessment. So I think we could think about continuous assessment and terminal assessment. I know it's an unfortunate word to use, but we can have assessment throughout the course and we can have assessment at the end. So here's the challenge. If we have continuous assessment, some of our information is out of date. If we assessed it 6 months ago, it might no longer be an accurate portrayal of that student's capabilities. It could be that they've actually learned some more about that, or it could be they've forgotten it. So this is what I meant by having to have assessment systems that are both distributed and synoptic. We have to make sure that we're not collecting information just at the very end, but we also have to require that students integrate all their thinking that they've learned over the whole course towards the end. And as I said, there's no simple way to do this, but I think that, first of all, I would say there's a real problem in medical education because our students are so smart that they're very strategic. And so they say, will this count? And if it doesn't count, they won't do it. So, you know, I think there is, well, the purist in me says formative assessments should not be graded or scored. I think it's good for the students to do it, and therefore some way of actually making it count towards the final score, I think is very important. So I think that there's a trade-off here, but the important point is it's about evidence. Basically, assessment is a process of reasoning from evidence. And so we have to think about how good is our evidence, how recent is our evidence, how extensive is our evidence. And if we think about the conclusions we draw at the end in medical education, are we going to let this person become a doctor? Then we need to think about all the evidence we can bring in, and we make those trade-offs. Yes, you know, this is more recent, that's longer ago, but you know, that was a high performance. So again, it's a messy business, but I think if we think about the idea of assessment as a process of evidentiary reasoning, we will generally make smarter decisions. But I do suggest that we stop using the terms formative assessments and summative assessments, and rather talk about assessments used formatively or assessments used summatively.
I'd really like to echo many of those thoughts, and a bit like Dylan, I tend to work in frameworks because all of our contexts are difficult. I like the sense of it being messy. That certainly summarises the clinical practice aspects of my life, to be honest. But I think we can focus much more on some of those theoretical frameworks to sort of govern what we do. And the key thing for me is the purpose of assessment. We do an awful lot of mislabeling, which means that we understand it poorly as faculty, and our students get very, very confused. So that literacy is important. I think thinking about the value of assessment for me really matters. And the difference between doing too much and too little assessment for me is not about the time that this occupies, but it's the value that we get out of it as teachers, but particularly the value that they get out of it as learners in terms of moving them forwards. A thing that's been very, very appealing for me is that sense of, okay, assessment that's used for formative purposes, so for learning, or as I seem to remember in one of your talks, Dylan, you talked about assessment that was fit for learning, which I've always really liked as a sense of this has got to be good enough to drive learning forwards. And there's a sense that we can use that throughout the lifespan of a module or a curricular year, but we're very, very clear that we're taking these multiple biopsies of quite integrated knowledge at the right level and at the right time. So we're moving our learners towards that higher stakes test that our regulators require us to do. But we're clear, and our learners are relatively clear about what that assessment's going to look like, and that we hopefully have a reasonable expectation that they'll get through. And that when we're making a decision overall, we're using all of that data in a very, I guess, a measured way. And for me, that speaks back to curricula and a need to move away from these very specialty block-based curricula that lots of people use. So, you know, this is my 2 weeks in cardiology, my 2 weeks in big toenail surgery, my 2 weeks in surgery of the left ankle or something like that. Well, as you've seen very neatly from Dylan, retention and learning from that is going to be very, very poor. So let's think about how we practice, and that increasingly we practice in a very integrated fashion. And there's the opportunity to say, for me, I work in stroke and neurosciences in my clinical life, that I might have some elderly medicine, some radiology, some stroke, some neurology, but those things are interleaved in that longer placement. And what I can do is I can start to set out different types of assessment throughout that placement that are capturing both that discipline-specific context that I guess we're interested in, but we can build that sense of difficulty. So like Dylan, I really like Bjork and Bjork's sense of desirable difficulty. As the learners become more experienced in that placement, you're adding to some of that complexity, because it links to the kind of things they're seeing in practice. And I think if you can get that framework right, it becomes the least, I guess, the least worst attempt at assessment in your curriculum. So for a long time, I've said we shouldn't be seeking perfection. Perfection is the enemy of the good. And show me a perfect assessment system, you show me somebody who's probably lost in their own fantasy. So it's largely about how we make it better. And I think how our narratives are about helping learners move forward. Because in MedEd, we've tended to forget about that. We've been focused on very structured, very standardized tests. It's all about me and my organization and my reliable test. And I guess less about the learner. But I'll hand back to the floor to see if there are any other questions.
Okay, yes, go ahead, please. Can I have the microphone here?
Thank you very much. Dr. Ali Al-Ghamdi, Al-Bahi University. I would like to thank the speaker for the nice presentation we had. My question is to Professor William. You stress in the long-term memory, and we know that the long-term skill and memory will affect the eventual practice for the health practitioner. And as you know that the design of most of the medical curriculum is based on integrated modules, and some of them are small and short modules. Does this contradictory the theory you are talking about, and what are the practical solution or the advice for designing curriculum in order to really have a long-term knowledge and skill for the student to be retained? So that advice for the curriculum design.
One of the big arguments in medical education was the move towards more integrated curricula, which when I was at King's College, we had a real challenge with 3 years of biomedical sciences, and then students going out on the wards in their 4th year, and suddenly discovering they didn't really want to be doctors after all, because they were spending a lot of time with sick people. Yeah. So, I think that the idea of integrating, but I think what Richard said is actually the best framework. It's to think about, yes, these short courses don't achieve what they want. They make us feel good because we taught our content, but it's focusing on what the lecturer is putting into the process, not what the students are getting out of it. And so I think thinking of a structure that will allow us to have these more authentic experiences, but then to make sure that we don't lose the disciplinary content. And I think that's the challenge, is to get the authentic experiences which are engaging and motivating and help students think about how this might really apply, but also they need those content segments in there, and those things need to be reviewed regularly for that knowledge to become integrated. I remember talking to Paul Boughton, who was in charge of the undergraduate medical education degree at King's, and he was saying that his sense was that medical practitioners reintegrated most of what they learned over their 5 years of medical training in England over the next 5 years. So basically, the pieces were kind of coming together because their experiences at college had been so kind of fractured that the links between the contents weren't there, and they were left to make those connections for themselves, which they obviously did in practice because they were forced to think about these things in an integrated way. And I'm just thinking, just following what Richard was saying, I think we could do a lot better in pre-service medical training. I think we could actually make it more relevant, more integrated, and not lose the disciplinary content. And that seems to be the challenge. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's going to be worth doing because that's what the research says makes for sticky learning.
And if I can come in there, just again to echo that the big challenge for me is when we have that very fractured learning that you described, and certainly I recall going through at medical school myself, Dylan, is from a patient safety perspective, I land in service and I actually have no sense of sometimes how to make all this stick together when I get the first or the second patient on my shift is somebody who doesn't fit the nice narrow box of the cardiology take or the surgery take. And I think that perhaps it's less evidence-based, but certainly some nice approaches to practice, I think, appearing all over the world, whereas you move learners through that 5 or 6 year curricula, the placements in the last couple of years in particular become much more focused on, as you say, being sticky and actually posing, well, I guess, and again, starting to introduce at that sort of 4th, 5th, 6th year level, that sense of bringing problems in that people solve. So I moved from moving through my worked examples that I looked at in 1st and 2nd year med school into some of those real life patient problems. They're authentic because they're sat there on the ward in that respect, but they're authentic because we're asking people to learn how to approach and solve problems they're going to be routinely dealing in practice. And for me, it's also been a great way of engaging faculty in wards and clinics, because we're thinking about nesting that teaching, that learning, that assessment opportunity in the work that they are doing routinely. I'm not dragging them into a lecture theatre to deliver the talk. I'm not asking them to go off and write a 100-item single best answer question, as valuable or otherwise as that might be. And we're not over-relying on the challenges of the OSCE. And for 15 plus years now for me of working in that field, I've slowly but surely become more and more disillusioned in terms of what the OSCE can and can't do. And perhaps the need for us to challenge some of what I'm going to call a sacred cow in that respect, and think differently about our assessment. But the key message for me is it all comes back to learning design. The assessment just needs to sit and nestle with that, rather than sat as something separate that we do and we sort of bolt on to the curriculum.
But I think just to add one more thing onto that, that's why I think it's important to recognise that we can't be evidence-based in our practice, because when we go to the evidence cupboard, we often find there's nothing in there. And so we are forced to rely on our professional judgment. So, but what I would argue is that when the research is there, we should use it. But we should also be aware that the research actually often isn't there. And we do have to rely on clinical judgment, on our experiences, on the experiences of those around us. But we need to be careful about, are we comparing like with like? And that's why I come back to this phrase. Medical educators need to become critical consumers of educational research. We need to say, well, that study produced a different result, but that was in a very different context. So how can I be sure it applies here? And there's no simple fix here. We have to become critical consumers of research.
Okay, because of time, we'll take the last question, please. Professor Badr.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank both professors for very interesting presentation that we have enjoyed. My question really is about the change that Professor Fuller mentioned. When do you change and why do you change? If you are in a situation where you are assessing the assessment methods that you are currently using, do we have any certain indicators that we should look at to say that our assessment methods now are in a stage where we have to change? The indicators that we should look at in a process assessing our current assessment methods. Are we satisfied with the current situation and we keep it? Or we say, depending on these indicators that we have seen now, we think that we are in a stage that we have to change. Can we have like some idea about these indicators that we should carefully look at, please?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question, and I get where you're coming from, because after a year of delivering a curriculum, you've got your multiple assessments out of the way. The place is still standing. Faculty haven't quite fallen out, and there's not been a student revolution. It's easy at that point to think we've survived another year. I think it's critical to look carefully at our assessments But I think the first question I would ask is how clear we are about the purpose of what we do. And it's when I've worked with colleagues all over the world, and I've soul searched myself with our own practice, there is that sense of how clear are we about why we are doing this and what we're seeking to test. And it's often one of the things that people fail on at that first hurdle. They're very good at telling us they do an OSCE and some workplace assessment and they use technology and whatever. But that critical, the what, really is quite challenging. So I think the opportunity to take a life laundry, if you will, about assessment is useful around the purpose, how clear we are as faculty and how clear our students are. But also picking up with Dylan, there is a proportion of good evidence out there that we can look at with perhaps a critical eye. I think some of the big consensus statements on what make good assessment frameworks are really valuable to look at. So the work that John Norsini and colleagues refreshed at the last Ottawa Consensus Conference, which is it's 2018, I think for me was still very valuable because it didn't narrow context. It talked people through a framework about how good is your assessment, focusing on the purpose, the design, the scheduling, but particularly about the outcomes. And I like it because it didn't necessarily talk about tools. We're very, very focused on our tools, aren't we? And we're very tribal with tools in medicine, that I'm a physician, I must have this set of tools. The surgeons have got something else that's named something else. The gynecologists name their own versions. And that isn't helpful for learners and not particularly helpful for patients. So I think the evidence is out there to go and have a look. And I'd recommend in medicine those consensus statements. However, I'd also encourage us to, as I said in my talk, look outside of medicine, because we don't do theory particularly well. Many of the things that Dylan has been talking about, which have been nested in the literature for a long time, some of us are only just discovering. So we're very, very conservative as a profession, and particularly in relation to education. So it's look outside of the box, and to what extent we're comfortable with some of those theories about authentic assessment, that assessment's fit for learning. Is our assessment, as David Bowder would say, truly sustainable? Are we designing systems that are moving our learners forwards? We're thinking about the environment, the feedback, that sense of understanding longitudinal learner progression. So I think we need to look in a different way to say, well, is this just a collection of single best answers and OSCE assessments in a toolbox? And I think there's the frameworks that are out there can be a good place to start.
Just at one point, and if that wasn't hard enough, I think we also need to take into account the fact that assessments are important not just for what they mean, but for what they do to our students. So as Richard Stiggins said now nearly 30 years ago, assessment literacy involves asking, does this assessment have utility for its intended purpose? Does it tell us what we need to know about our doctors? But what is the impact of this assessment system on the key stakeholders? And I think, if we don't take that question into account, then we might end up with solutions that are fine on paper, but just really don't work in the real world. So I think that, this idea of what do assessments mean and what do assessments do, I think provides a very useful framework for thinking about this.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you all, both Professor Fuller, Professor William. Many thanks for you being with us here, and I would like to thank also Professor Hamza and all the audience for being here until now. We look forward to have a break for 15 minutes, and we will be back at 4 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Dylan. That was fun.
It was, wasn't it? Yes. Not much disagreement, but
Well, I guess